The courtroom was quiet, save for the sound of the gavel striking the wooden surface. Judge William Thompson, an older man with a reputation for being stern and no-nonsense, glanced down at the paperwork in front of him. His glasses sat low on his nose, and his furrowed brow reflected the routine nature of the case he was about to hear. It was a traffic violation, nothing out of the ordinary. "Naomi Williams," he called, looking up to see the woman standing before him. Naomi stepped forward, adjusting her blazer. She was a striking figure, tall, poised, and dressed in a tailored suit that seemed out of place in a courtroom typically filled with the usual array of defendants. Her calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the tension in the room. A slight, almost imperceptible nod in the judge's direction was her only response as she awaited the proceedings. Judge Thompson briefly skimmed through the file in front of him. "You're accused of running a red light last week at the intersection of 5th and Maple," he said, his voice even, almost detached. "Do you have anything to say in your defense?" Naomi met his gaze, her eyes steady. "I understand the charge, Your Honor," she replied. "But I was in a rush to get to a meeting where my presence was required to discuss an ongoing legal matter. It wasn't an intentional infraction." Judge Thompson nodded but didn't seem particularly moved by her explanation. "Regardless of your reasons, running a red light is a violation of the law," he said, leaning forward slightly. "You'll need to pay the fine." Naomi's face remained composed, though a hint of frustration flickered in her eyes. She had seen this process countless times before. The rush to judgment, the assumption that people like her were no more than the sum of their offenses. But she was no stranger to the courtroom, and she had learned long ago to play the game, even when it seemed like the odds were stacked against her. "Understood, Your Honor," Naomi said simply, stepping back to stand in line with the other defendants, waiting for the ruling to be finalized. Judge Thompson scribbled something down on the paper before him, issuing the fine without much thought. He glanced up once more, studying her for a moment. There was something about Naomi Williams, something that set her apart from the usual defendants that passed through his courtroom. She wasn't just another person caught in the legal system. There was a quiet intensity about her that spoke of experience, wisdom, and perhaps something deeper than what appeared on the surface. Naomi stepped forward again when her name was called, accepting the fine with a polite nod. As she turned to leave, her back straight and confident, Judge Thompson couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was more significant than he had initially thought. He watched her walk out of the courtroom, her purposeful stride leaving him with a lingering curiosity. Little did he know, Naomi Williams wasn't just a woman paying a fine. She was someone who was quietly rewriting the rules, and her next move would change everything. Naomi Williams stepped out of the courtroom into the brisk afternoon air, the sounds of the city rushing around her. The weight of the fine, though irritating, was just another part of her day. She had more important matters to focus on. Today, like most days, was filled with meetings, calls, and preparations for her ongoing legal battles. What the judge didn't know, what most people didn't know, was that Naomi was no ordinary attorney. Her work extended far beyond the confines of traffic violations and minor cases. She was leading some of the most significant anti-discrimination lawsuits in the country. Naomi's journey had not been an easy one. Raised in a working-class neighborhood by parents who always emphasized the importance of education and perseverance, she had always known the sting of inequality. As a young woman of color, Naomi had experienced firsthand the subtle and not-so-subtle ways that systems of power tried to push people like her to the margins. But instead of becoming disillusioned, Naomi used those experiences to fuel her desire to create change. She became a lawyer, determined to dismantle the very systems that had tried to hold her back. Her law firm, which specialized in civil rights cases, had taken on some of the toughest battles. She had filed high-profile lawsuits against powerful corporations accused of discriminatory hiring practices, and she had represented countless individuals who had been unfairly treated due to their race or gender. Naomi's cases often made the front pages of newspapers and drew the attention of national media. But for every win, there were always new challenges waiting, She had been threatened, dismissed, and underestimated at every turn, but it only made her more resolute. Today, Naomi was in the midst of one of her biggest battles yet, a lawsuit against a major tech company accused of systemic bias in its hiring and promotion practices. The company had deep pockets and powerful allies, but Naomi wasn't intimidated. Her clients, a group of former employees, had all been subjected to what they believed was racial discrimination in their hiring and advancement opportunities. Naomi had been working tirelessly for months, gathering evidence, preparing witnesses, and strategizing her every move. It was a long fight, but Naomi knew that if she could win this case, it could set a precedent that would force other companies to rethink how they treated employees. As she sat in her office that evening, poring over case files and legal briefs, Naomi allowed herself a moment to reflect on how far she had come. She wasn't just fighting for her clients, she was fighting for the future, hoping that each victory would pave the way for others to follow. What she didn't know was that, back in his office, Judge Thompson had started to dig deeper into her background. His brief encounter with Naomi had left an impression on him, and the more he learned about her, the more he realized that she was someone with a far-reaching influence, someone who was quietly challenging the very foundations of the system he had worked within for years. As he sat at his desk, scrolling through news articles about Naomi's past cases, he couldn't help but feel that their paths would cross again. Judge William Thompson sat at his desk late into the night, a cup of cold coffee beside him, as he scrolled through article after article on Naomi Williams. What had started as idle curiosity now felt like an obligation. The more he read, the more he realized that Naomi wasn't just another attorney. She was a force in the legal world, a woman whose work was reshaping the very structures that had kept people like her, and countless others, on the outside looking in. Her name had appeared in headlines over the years, but it wasn't until recently that Thompson took notice of her impact. Naomi had filed groundbreaking lawsuits against several high-profile companies, some of the nation's largest, all accused of discriminatory practices. Each case Naomi took on seemed bigger than the last, and her reputation had grown into something unignorable. She wasn't just representing clients, she was challenging decades of systemic injustice. There was the landmark case against a financial institution, where Naomi exposed a culture of racial bias in hiring practices, resulting in the company agreeing to a multi-million-dollar settlement and agreeing to overhaul their recruitment policies. Then there was her high-stakes case against a media conglomerate accused of gender discrimination in its leadership ranks. Naomi's argument had not only led to a favorable settlement for her clients, but had forced the company to implement new diversity initiatives across the board. Each victory was significant, but the undercurrent of her work was even more profound. Naomi's cases weren't just about winning money. They were about dismantling a system that had for too long upheld inequalities, often hidden in plain sight. Thompson found himself haunted by her profile. There was an underlying urgency in her work, an intensity that seemed to call out for something more than just legal victories. As he read through the transcripts of one of her recent courtroom victories, the words she had spoken seemed to echo in his mind. It's not enough to win a case. What matters is that the case serves as a stepping stone for others. What matters is changing the system itself. He paused, staring at his screen. The more he learned about Naomi, the more he realized how little he had truly understood the struggles people like her faced. He thought about the case he had just presided over, the one with the fine. Naomi had been there, in front of him, calm and collected, yet he had no idea who she really was. He had issued a fine without a second thought, without recognizing that this was a woman who was not only contributing to the legal system, but was actively working to change it. The shame began to creep in. His judgment had been swift, unquestioning, and now, knowing the woman he had fined was at the forefront of the fight for civil rights, he couldn't help but wonder if he had done something wrong. He felt a pull to understand more about Naomi, to see if there was any way he could make amends, or at least learn from the lessons she was teaching the world. By the time he closed his laptop, the seed of an idea had been planted. He had to find a way to speak with her, to understand her work and her perspective more deeply. He knew their paths would cross again, and when they did, things wouldn't be the same. For days, Judge Thompson couldn't shake the thought of Naomi Williams. He replayed the brief encounter in his mind over and over, each time with more clarity. The fine he had imposed felt trivial now, a small, misplaced action in the grand scope of her life and work. He began to wonder about his role in the system, about how often he had made judgments without truly understanding the full picture. It wasn't just the traffic violation that bothered him. It was the recognition that, in his own career, he had passed countless decisions that had likely affected people just like Naomi. People who, whether they knew it or not, were fighting battles far larger than the issues at hand. He had seen defendants come and go, their cases rarely leaving an impression on him. But Naomi was different. She wasn't just another person who had made a mistake or misstep. She was someone who had a purpose, a mission, and had dedicated her life to ensuring that others didn't have to suffer in silence. Judge Thompson's thoughts grew increasingly uneasy as he thought about his past rulings. He had always prided himself on being fair, objective, impartial. But now, as he sifted through the past cases that had crossed his desk, he couldn't help but question whether he had always been as impartial as he believed. How often had he, unknowingly, been a part of a system that had overlooked or underrepresented the very people Naomi was fighting for? How often had his own biases, subtle, perhaps even unconscious, affected his decisions? A restless night followed, and in the early hours of the morning, Judge Thompson found himself going through the case files of some of the most significant rulings he had presided over. He was searching for any pattern, any sign that he had been fair in his judgments. What he found, to his surprise, were instances where his decisions could have been more empathetic, more understanding. There were cases where he had issued rulings with little thought to the underlying circumstances of the individuals involved. Those decisions had been swift, based purely on the letter of the law, but now he questioned whether that had been enough. As he closed the last file and rubbed his eyes, a sense of unease lingered. He was a man of law, but perhaps there was more to justice than simply following the rules. Naomi had shown him that. She wasn't just a lawyer. She was a catalyst for change, using her voice to speak for those who couldn't speak for themselves. She was reminding him that the law wasn't always as just as it seemed, and that sometimes the system needed to be re-examined. It was then that the idea of reaching out to Naomi took root. He didn't know exactly what he hoped to accomplish, but he knew that he needed to learn more. She had opened his eyes to the fact that the pursuit of justice required more than just a knowledge of the law. It required understanding, empathy, and the willingness to challenge the status quo. The next day, Thompson began to draft a letter, unsure of what to say, but knowing that somehow it had to be said. Naomi Williams sat at her desk, surrounded by stacks of legal documents, her computer screen aglow with case files. The hum of the city outside her office window was a distant murmur, a constant reminder of the world she was tirelessly fighting to change. It was just past midnight, but Naomi wasn't tired. She rarely was. There was always something more pressing, another case to prepare, another injustice to challenge, another person depending on her to stand up for what was right. Tonight, the weight of her work felt heavier than usual. She had been preparing for a major court appearance the next morning, where she would present the final arguments in a landmark case against one of the country's most influential tech giants. The case involved a group of former employees, all of whom had been subjected to biased hiring practices and systemic discrimination in promotions. Naomi knew the company had deep pockets and powerful legal teams, but she also knew that she had something more powerful on her side: truth. Her clients, several Black and Latinx former employees, had trusted her to hold the company accountable for practices that had been quietly perpetuated for years. Naomi had spent months gathering evidence, speaking with witnesses, and uncovering hidden documents that demonstrated a clear pattern of discrimination. She had built an airtight case, but the real challenge was convincing the court that these practices were not just isolated incidents. This was a systemic issue that affected thousands of people, and Naomi intended to make sure that the court understood just how deeply the bias ran. The stakes couldn't have been higher. A win in this case wouldn't just mean compensation for her clients. It would send a ripple through corporate America, showing that no company, no matter how powerful, could get away with perpetuating inequality behind closed doors. Naomi was determined to make sure the message was loud and clear. As she reviewed her notes one last time, her phone buzzed. It was a text message from her assistant. "You've got a message from Judge Thompson. He wants to meet with you." Naomi paused, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Judge William Thompson, the very same judge who had fined her for a simple traffic violation just a few weeks ago. She couldn't help but feel a flash of confusion. Why would a judge, especially one of his standing, reach out to her? And what could he possibly want? She hadn't thought about the fine much since that day. It had been just one small blip in the rhythm of her demanding life. But now, the message made her pause. Naomi wasn't one to entertain surprises, especially from the judicial system. She had learned long ago to expect little from those in power. Still, her curiosity piqued, and she resolved to find out what he wanted. As she read the message again, a thought crossed her mind. Could this be a sign that something was shifting? She pushed the thought aside. There was too much at stake tomorrow to be distracted. But as she prepared for bed, she couldn't help but wonder what had brought the judge to reach out. And perhaps more importantly, what it meant for the future of her work. The next morning, Naomi found herself standing in front of a nondescript building in downtown, waiting for the meeting with Judge Thompson. She had agreed to meet him, though her thoughts were a whirlwind of uncertainty. The judge had reached out to her through her assistant the day before, requesting a private conversation. It was an unexpected move, especially considering their prior interaction in court. A traffic violation, a fine, and yet, here she was, about to meet one of the most powerful figures in the legal system. Naomi's instincts told her to stay cautious. Judges weren't typically known for reaching out to lawyers in such a personal manner, and especially not after an exchange as impersonal as the one they'd shared in the courtroom. Still, her curiosity got the best of her, and after some deliberation, she'd agreed to give him a few minutes of her time. She entered the building and made her way to the designated meeting room, where she was greeted by Judge Thompson. His usual stern demeanor softened as he stood up to greet her, extending a hand. Naomi shook it firmly, but remained silent, waiting for him to speak first. "Ms. Williams, thank you for agreeing to meet with me," Thompson began, his voice steady but carrying a hint of hesitation. "I won't waste your time. I wanted to personally apologize for how our last encounter went." Naomi raised an eyebrow, taken aback by the sincerity in his tone. "I'm listening, Your Honor," she said, her voice calm but measured, as she sat down across from him. "I issued a fine that day, and I didn't realize the magnitude of who you are and what you do," he continued. "I'll admit it. I made a snap judgment based on what seemed like just another traffic case, not knowing that the woman standing in front of me was at the forefront of one of the most important battles our legal system is facing. I've spent some time looking into your work, and I've come to the realization that I failed to see the full picture." Naomi leaned back in her chair, listening intently. She had faced her share of dismissive attitudes in her career, but there was something different in his tone now. Thompson wasn't just offering an apology. He was acknowledging something deeper, something that she hadn't expected from a judge who had, until recently, appeared indifferent. "I've been reflecting on my career, my decisions, and the work that people like you are doing," Thompson said, his eyes focused, his voice unwavering. "I realize now that I've been a part of a system that often doesn't give enough weight to people's lived experiences. I want to change that." Naomi was quiet for a moment, absorbing the judge's words. She had been prepared for the usual defensive stance or a bland apology, but this felt different. He wasn't just offering a platitude. He was engaging with the broader issue at hand. "I appreciate your honesty, Judge Thompson," Naomi finally said. "But an apology is only the beginning. Acknowledging the problem is step one. Now it's about what comes next. It's about real change, not just words. Thompson nodded, acknowledging the truth in her statement. "I agree," he said, "and I want to help. I've been thinking about what I can do. What we can do, together, to make sure the law reflects true fairness. I want to be a part of the solution, not just a bystander." Naomi was taken aback. The sincerity in his offer was rare, and in that moment, something shifted within her. Perhaps, just perhaps, the change she had been fighting for could come from unexpected places she had long given up on. They sat in silence for a moment, two individuals from opposite sides of the judicial world, united by the belief that justice could, and should, be more than a concept. It could be a living, breathing reality for everyone. "Let's see where this can go," Naomi said quietly, offering the slightest hint of a smile. For the first time in a long while, Naomi felt that her relentless pursuit of justice might just be gaining an unexpected ally. Over the next few weeks, Naomi and Judge Thompson continued their private discussions. Initially, their meetings were cautious, filled with a sense of mutual curiosity, but gradually they began to find common ground. The judge's sincerity, combined with Naomi's willingness to engage, opened a door neither of them had expected. Thompson had been haunted by his earlier realizations. The more he learned about Naomi's work, the more he saw how the system he had spent his life working within had failed to address the inequities that plagued society. Naomi wasn't just a lawyer fighting for compensation. She was an agent of change, dismantling the very structures that allowed bias to fester. For years, Thompson had simply enforced the law without questioning its deeper impact. Now, he was seeing it through Naomi's eyes, a lens of justice that didn't just seek to uphold the letter of the law, but the spirit of it. At the same time, Naomi was beginning to recognize that Thompson wasn't just an old-fashioned judge stuck in his ways. He was a man who had the power to influence change, and his willingness to examine his own actions spoke volumes. She had long been skeptical of figures in power, especially those in the judicial system, but Thompson was proving that even those entrenched in the system could evolve. He was questioning, learning, and striving to understand his role in perpetuating systemic inequalities. One afternoon, Thompson invited Naomi to a seminar on judicial reform, where he had been asked to speak. He had agreed, with Naomi as his guest, to use the platform as a way to address the issues they had discussed. The event was held in a grand conference room, filled with legal professionals, community leaders, and activists. Naomi's presence was notable. She was often seen in the courtroom, but rarely in these circles of high-ranking officials. As Thompson took the stage, he felt the weight of the audience's expectations. He had spent years in courtrooms, delivering judgments, but never had he spoken with such purpose. His opening words were simple but powerful. "Today, I want to acknowledge something that I've learned. The law is not just about punishing wrongdoers. It is about fairness, justice, and equality for everyone who comes before us." He paused, scanning the room, and then continued. "I've been fortunate enough to meet someone whose work has shown me that the system we've relied on has often been blind to the very inequalities it was meant to remedy. Ms. Naomi Williams has taught me that justice is not about the laws we write, but about the way we ensure those laws protect everyone." The room fell silent as the crowd absorbed his words. Naomi, sitting near the back, felt a flicker of something she hadn't expected: hope. For years, she had fought against the complacency of those in power, and now, here was a judge standing before a room full of his peers, admitting that the very system he had served needed change. When Thompson finished speaking, Naomi was invited to the stage to share her thoughts. She wasn't sure what to expect, but as she stood beside him, looking out at the audience, a sense of unity settled in. The room that had once felt like a fortress of indifference now seemed like a place where change could begin. "I'm grateful for the judge's words," Naomi began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "But I'll be honest, I don't just want apologies. I want action. The real challenge is moving from acknowledgement to real, tangible steps that impact the lives of those who have been marginalized for too long. The crowd applauded, and Naomi felt a quiet satisfaction. Change was happening. Slowly, but it was happening. With Thompson by her side, Naomi realized that the fight for justice wasn't always about going it alone. Sometimes, the most unlikely allies could help rewrite the story. In the months that followed, Naomi and Judge Thompson's collaboration became more than just a partnership. It became a movement. Their work together sparked conversations across legal and community circles, pushing the boundaries of what was traditionally seen as justice. Naomi continued her tireless fight in the courtroom, but now, with Thompson's support, she was able to reach new audiences, including lawmakers, fellow judges, and corporate leaders. Their alliance began to shape the future of civil rights law in ways neither could have imagined. Together, they launched a series of public forums and workshops aimed at educating legal professionals about the subtle and often overlooked biases that permeated the legal system. Naomi spoke passionately about the need for systemic reform, and Thompson, once a quiet participant in the legal system, found his voice. He spoke openly about his own past failures and the lessons he had learned from Naomi's work, urging his colleagues to confront their own biases. Their efforts started to bear fruit. In the courtroom, Naomi's cases became even more powerful. She had the ear of influential figures who were now more willing to listen, and the legal reforms she had fought for began to take shape. One of the most significant victories came when Naomi helped spearhead a nationwide initiative to reform hiring practices in large corporations, forcing many to revisit their diversity and inclusion policies. Companies that had once turned a blind eye to systemic bias were now actively seeking ways to change. Meanwhile, Thompson became a vocal advocate for judicial reform. He began to work alongside legislators to propose changes in the way judges were trained and the types of cases that were given priority. He fought for policies that ensured judges were better equipped to recognize and address the hidden biases that could influence their rulings. His efforts didn't go unnoticed. A growing number of his peers were following his lead, advocating for a more transparent and inclusive legal system. One afternoon, months after their first meeting, Naomi found herself sitting across from Judge Thompson in a meeting room at a law conference. They had just finished presenting together at an event on legal reform, and the applause from the audience still echoed in her ears. The shift in their partnership and in their work was palpable. Naomi, who had spent so much of her life fighting the system, now found herself part of an unprecedented collaboration with someone who had once been a symbol of that system's flaws. Thompson smiled, his once stern face now marked with a sense of fulfillment. "I never thought I'd be here," he said, his voice tinged with gratitude. "But I'm glad I am. We're making a difference, Naomi. Together, we're starting to change how the system sees people." Naomi returned his smile, a spark of determination in her eyes. "We're just getting started, Judge. This is only the beginning." As they walked out of the conference room together, Naomi felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead was still long, but for the first time, it felt like they had more than just a chance to win. They had the power to transform the system from the inside out. And as long as they continued to work together, Naomi knew that the future could be different, fairer, more just, for everyone.